Hello everyone, welcome to the Hi Olivia P podcast. Today we'll be discussing the abduction and murder of 15-year-old Kerrie Ann Brown from a house party in Thompson, Manitoba in 1986. In Season 5 of the CBC podcast, Someone Knows Something, David Ridgen teams up with Kerrie's youngest brother Trevor to investigate the murder and try to find some answers.
In Episode 1, Kerrie's youngest brother, introduced as David Ridgen, arrives at the house Kerrie was living in at the time of her murder, where Jim Brown, her father, and Trevor still reside today.
It's also shared between Trevor and David, which I found very interesting, that Trevor believes a raven saw what happened and could recount who did it to Kerrie and what really went on that night in 1986. Start quote, "I think of the ravens have all the answers. They remembered the faces of the people that did this to her. Maybe the ravens will show us one day. Trevor."
Yeah, and I remember something Trevor saying about wanting to stick around long enough to see if maybe there was a way for the ravens to tell us what they saw. But back to his interview with Jim. Trevor said that, start quote, "I never once had an argument with her." And Jim also recalls that Kerrie never had a purse that night when she was going to the party, and he claims that she would have brought one had she been planning to stay over at her friend Nicole's house that night. So this also poses the question to the audience, did Kerrie actually plan to stay at Nicole's house that night, or did she have other plans for the evening, which could have led her getting murdered?
Also, Kerrie seemed to have wandered off and away from the party before Nicole could go get her purse and then come back. So, where was she walking to?
And Kerrie would have willingly walked to the vehicle, as it was noticed that Kerrie's and only Kerrie's footsteps were seen imprinted in the snow. But after a short trail, tire tracks cover the footprints, and they seem to stop. It almost seems that she got into the car on her own without a struggle, so maybe she trusted the person?
The evidence from outside the house of the party leads some to ask, was this actually a real abduction? Or did Kerrie get into the car on her own? And if so, then why? In the next episode, they explored the day and woman who discovered Kerrie's body in October 1986, Donna. Donna was riding horses with a friend one October morning. When they passed the stables and cemetery of a common party and drinking area, Donna's horses noticed something. Donna searched and discovered the body of a young girl, and she had been following the news and radio. She immediately knew it was Kerrie Brown.
Donna was also able to see that Kerrie had been brutally beaten by her attackers. After she found Kerrie and the public became aware, rumors began floating around about Kerrie's body. Some claimed that she was naked, and some even tried to say that sticks were shoved into her body in various places. Neither rumor was true, and Donna explained how that angered her, as Kerrie deserved more justice than what she was getting.
She could tell somebody had brought and left her. Donna also questioned, how can the people live with themselves, knowing they committed a 30-year-old homicide?
The inflictions done upon Kerrie remind many of the abduction and murder of another teenage girl from Manitoba, Helen Betty Osborne.
A Cree Aboriginal girl from Norway House, an Indigenous peoples community, was abducted, raped, and later murdered by 4 white men.
The men, after forcing her into a car, assaulted her and continued the beating at a cabin at Clearwater Lake. After being repeatedly beaten and raped, Helen Betty Osborne was killed from being stabbed with a screwdriver 50 times. While the police had enough evidence, such as blood and hair from Helen Betty, the men would not admit to being
into her body in various places. Neither rumor was true, and Donna explained how that angered her, as Kerrie deserved more justice than what she was getting.
She could tell somebody had brought and left her. Donna also questioned, how can the people live with themselves, knowing they committed a 30-year-old homicide?
Donna has been changed forever from this experience. She had become involved years ago in the investigation, which is also the largest
volume historic case.
The inflictions done upon Kerrie remind many of the abduction and murder of another teenage girl from Manitoba, Helen Betty Osborne.
A Cree Aboriginal girl from Norway House, an Indigenous peoples community, was abducted, raped, and later murdered by 4 white men.
The men, after forcing her into a car, assaulted her and continued the beating at a cabin at Clearwater Lake. After being repeatedly beaten and raped, Helen Betty Osborne was killed from being stabbed with a screwdriver 50 times. While the police had enough evidence, such as blood and hair from Helen Betty, the men would not admit to the killing. Because of the case went unsolved for many years. The murder led to the Osborne family falling apart, with her parents getting divorced and her brother being constantly in and out of the penitentiary.
The same thing happened with Kerrie's family after her death, with her older brother Ian spiraling even faster towards rock bottom, and Trevor accumulating several mental disorders, such as severe depression and anxiety.
Because these cases are so similar, could the Helen Betty Osborne case possibly help find the killers of Kerrie Ann Brown?
I think it definitely could help, because the two situations are very similar, so police and detectives could see these similarities and apply them to the investigation to see if anything adds up.
The next topic of discussion on the podcast was the one and only conviction for the case, Patrick Sumner. Sumner was the only suspect in charge that was brought for the case till this day, but the charges were dropped after not enough evidence could be found to convict him.
David Ridgen got a hold of a very important witness from the case and Sumner accusations, Sean Simmons. Simmons claimed to have seen Sumner in the car pulling out of the stables at around the hour that Kerrie would have been taken and murdered.
Keep in mind that also Kerrie's body was found by Donna near the stables, so it all adds up. The timing, the destination, everything.
Yeah, Sean told David that he saw a greenish-looking sports car along with a white van coming out of the stables at around midnight, I believe, and claims that he saw Sumner's face, a scrawny man with scraggly hair pulling up on his right side, very quickly speeding into town. He specifically says that the car does 80 miles into town, while the van slowed down, plus diminished backwards.
Yes, and as I remember, Simmons thought this was very odd. But at the time, Kerrie was not reported missing, so he did not think much of it. So, when the report came out that Kerrie was dead and that Sumner was not going to be charged with the murder, Sean explains, being quoted, "It felt like a murderer got away with something, like something was a failure," end quote.
To this day, more than 30 years after, Simmons still believes it was Sumner in that car, and he says with confidence, begin quote, "I'm 9 out of 10% sure it was Sumner in the car. 9 out of 10 he was involved," end quote. To add on, as well as the odd driving and stable experience the night of Kerrie's murder, blonde hairs were found in the back seat of Sumner's car. Kerrie had blonde hair.
Trevor later explained that, quote, "We all knew he was guilty, but there wasn't enough," end quote, and he stated that, "My dad is convinced that he knows something. The police are convinced that Sumner knows something," end quote.
But how is there not enough evidence to convict Sumner?
I know that it sounds a lot right now, like Sumner did it, but it must be kept in mind that he could very well be just as innocent as we think he is guilty.
Well, I see that point. It just seems to me that it all adds up too perfectly to be a simple coincidence and for Sumner to really have no part at all in the Kerrie Ann Brown case.
There are so many different versions of the story that even Trevor explained, quote, "I don't even know the narrative anymore," end quote.
Next up, Trevor attempts to locate Patrick Sumner. Patrick was known as trying to fit the crowd, but always didn't fit in and was very questionable or odd.
The only thing connecting Sumner to the case was Sean Simmons pointing the finger at him. Simmons drove a very similar car to Patrick Sumner's, which caused a few problems for Simmons throughout the investigation.
One of the men who worked at the car wash had another claim against Sumner as well. Raleigh, a Thompson native, saw Patrick washing his car on a Friday, and Patrick seemed agitated and not his normal self. Patrick had been washing his car for more than hours, which Raleigh said seemed like he was cleaning away fingerprints.
Raleigh sold Patrick a car and stated he didn't feel comfortable around Sumner. Raleigh knew Sumner didn't change his wheels, but on the day after the murder, he did. All this detailed information is critical to the investigation, but it still isn't enough to arrest and convict Patrick Sumner.
After talking with Raleigh, we discovered that there are 3 cars that matched the killer's car. One of the car's owners was known as Mad Max. Mad Max had his name after his reckless driving and wild habits while he was on the road.
Max owned a green car, which was a similar car to the killer. Max had seen a similar car the night of Kerrie's death and said, "The car pulled out on me right," and had sworn it was Sumner's.
That night, Max had gone to an abandoned campsite and saw a mysterious tent. Max had said he saw flashlights lighting up the tent. Max says when his car headlights had turned on, he swore he saw a man of some sort standing alone. Could this be the same thing Sean Simmons saw that night? Kerrie's body was then found the next day, making the probability of the 2 men witnessing the same event quite likely. Max was driving around town that night until he was told to make less noise by an officer, as it was nearing the middle of the night, when Kerrie was murdered. Max and his friends, while playing car tag, went in to get coffee and later went back out around towards the stables at midnight.
Max had seen a van near the tent with lights on. After staying a while, the van pulled out and headed towards the highway, not the main road. They tried following the van, but lost it as it hit the highway. Max wishes he would have reported or followed the van.
After talking to Max, David talks on the phone with Kerrie's cousin, which he finds out he was involved in a Facebook group regarding Kerrie's case. Kerrie's cousin introduces David to a man named Gene, who had worked with the case and had new information.
They found out that Kerrie's body bag was reused, and they found black hairs in it, which Kerrie did not have. The whole crime scene was said to be very contaminated. Did the police know about this contamination?
Jean tells David about a call that came in during the time of the murder. The call came in before Kerrie's body was found and before any information was let out. DCC took the call and taped it. Later, she linked it to Kerrie's case.
Another interview with John Toes says he never heard anything about the phone call and admits that Jean isn't a credible source to follow. David then meets with Kenneth Jackson, who says the man on the phone sounded scared and was paranoid about being recorded.
Next, after talking with Kerrie's cousin, Ridgen goes over a tip about the murder heard in a bar by a woman named Luella.
A man in the bar, Fred Spence, was reportedly overheard saying, "How about when we killed that white girl?" after Kerrie's murder. Luella reported this to the police, who could do little, as Luella was the only person who overheard the statement, and there was nothing else he had said or did that Luella saw connected to the murder in any way.
It also has to be kept in mind that he could have been talking about anything, even quoting someone else or a fictional scenario he saw.
Anyway, David Ridgen took into his own hands to go find Fred and interview him to find out if he truly did say that in the bar 30 years ago, and if he had anything to do with the murder of Kerrie Ann Brown.
Fred lives in a sketchy town full of overcrowded homes and gangs on mostly every street. He has a long, dark history of drinking and domestic abuse, which only makes me think more that he would likely have something to do with Kerrie's death.
When David confronts him, it is noted that he is not calm and continuously fidgeting throughout the interview, seemingly agitated and unfocused. Through this interview, however, he stays non-aggressive but repeats the phrase, "I never said that," over and over many times.
Almost as if he's trying to believe himself in some way, like convince himself he didn't even say that, even if he knows he did.
Later on, David returns with Luella, who requested to come along so she could confront him and talk about what he said in the bar. This doesn't change anything, still repeating, "I never said that," except now a slight showing of aggression in his tone replaces the agitated one he portrayed in his previous interview with only David.
It is creepy knowing that there are so many possible suspects that could just be walking around in the town right now. Like, she heard him say that he killed a white girl. Who else could he have meant? Why would he have said that if he were lying?
It is also the question that Luella could have misinterpreted the words, hearing them out of context, or completely misheard what he said that night. Whatever the case, I do agree that there are so many possibilities and tips that one can never be certain. Trevor says his family side have many disorders and disease. Ian, his brother, struggles with a few severe mental illnesses. Ian has always had a bad relationship with Kerrie, and Kerrie was often uncomfortable around him.
The night of Kerrie's death, Ian came through the basement window, tracking mud on his boots around the house, which was suspicious. Ian wasn't capable of living on his own or getting his license because of his disorder. Ian self-medicates with alcohol and drinks every day.
This is also suspicious because of the boot print that was seen at the crime scene. Also, Ian's mental illness could have prompted him to do something like this to his own sister, and any drugs or alcohol or even hallucinations coming from any of his mental disorders could have given him enough power that it would have seemed as if many people participated in the killing, even if it was only him. This could also explain why Kerrie may have willingly gotten into whatever car took her at the end of the party, because if it was her own brother, she would have trusted him to take her home, maybe planning to call Nicole once she arrived home, which she never did, or was persuaded by Ian for some reason to go with him. Perhaps he said that Jim wanted her home or something along those lines.
Trevor said he never got interviewed. Kerrie did not trust Ian as she thought he was looking at her changing. She was afraid or uncomfortable. Ian's stepfather said the relationship was okay, but he felt behind all the time.
Ian had no license but stole a car. Trevor doesn't think he would ever be able to manhandle Kerrie because of his size and weight. Ian says he has thought of suicide many times after his mom and sister died.
Ian had claimed that Kerrie had invited him and his friend to a house party that night before one she attended. Trevor said Ian had lied because Kerrie would never hang out with him, let alone drink with him. Trevor says Ian had so many parts that doesn't match and can't tell which ones are true.
Trevor explained that Kerrie had always felt uncomfortable around Ian, telling him to go away whenever she had friends over. Ian's history of alcoholism and drug abuse could be reasoning behind why he would possibly do something like this. Perhaps he wanted revenge on his sister for humiliating him in front of her friends. But according to Trevor, Ian is a talker. He would have definitely have told somebody by now.
Next up, David finally finds out more information about the mysterious phone call that night in 1986, in which a man admitted on committing a murder and the woman on the police line who received it.
Marnie, the receiver of the phone call, heard a masculine voice over the phone telling her he just killed someone and needed to talk to a specific officer. The voice over the phone seemed to be in an intense state of panic. Since no one had been reported missing that night, Marnie did not think too much of this, but still reported the call. The next day, after Kerrie was reported missing, and killed, Marnie realized that she was just on the phone, most likely with the killer of the young girl.
She tried to tape the call for later use, but she was rushing to do so. She taped the call for about 5 feet away from the actual phone, therefore making it very hard to hear and making the voice unclear in the recording.
One strange thing about the call that night was that the person was never identified, and it did not seem to spark much interest to the police. Marnie says the police knew about it but swept it under the rug, while later Jean, an old officer, said that if they knew anything about the call, they would have went into further investigation.
This really shows how the investigators did not try as hard as they possibly could to find the murderers and find closure for all of Manitoba and the Brown family.
In the season finale, David Ridgen closes the Someone Knows Something podcast with a confrontation from a person whose viewpoints are what everyone had been waiting for, Patrick Sumner.
David drives alone to Sumner's house without warning and prompts Sumner to discuss about the murder. He goes alone without fear and that Trevor may act out if Sumner said something about the murder, and decides it would be best to scope out Sumner and his intentions in relations to the case before inviting Trevor along.
There was one thing in particular that caught my attention. This was that David noticed how there were newspaper articles containing accusations and assumptions about Sumner, filled with Sumner's own annotations in the blank spaces of the articles. He writes back to the authors with comments such as "not true" and "liars," a way of silently arguing back to the people who claimed he murdered Kerrie Ann Brown.
David asked him to tell him what happened, and Sumner responded harshly, saying, "Oh, how I got effed over? Yeah, I'll talk about that."
Also, Sumner states that part of the reason why he got accused had to do with his father's back acne and VA tomato juice.
Yes, a shirt was seen in Sumner's house that belonged to his father and had small splashes of blood on the shoulders and back. Investigators thought this was Sumner's shirt and Kerrie's blood, but it was just his dad's and the blood from pimples on his back. The VA bottle of tomato juice was spilled, and detectives also thought this was Kerrie's blood. However, it was only tomato juice.
Lastly, Sumner's alibi had to do something with him, seeing a baseball game that night on TV. This was very interesting to me because David did some research before returning with Trevor, and he discovered that no baseball game was on that night. There was one the night before.
Maybe Sumner's confusing the two nights. What I don't understand is what he saw on the television. I also thought that maybe he was hoping he'd get by with this alibi and hope no one noticed his flaw. I also found interesting that Sumner claims to have never been washing his car because he had no time the day before the murder. However, Raleigh, who worked at the wash and gas station, still stated that he saw Sumner scrubbing his car for hours, almost as if he was trying to get literally every single thing off his car. Who was telling the truth?
Next, David returns with Trevor to talk with Sumner again. We see here Trevor's anxiety as he prepares to meet his sister's possible murderer.
It's funny, Trevor almost seems shocked at what he sees. He claims that Kerrie would have left some type of recognizable mark on Sumner's body because she wouldn't go down without a fight, and Sumner is a pretty small man.
This brings up the point again that maybe somehow he got her to trust that night, or maybe he didn't do the killing, but still took part in some way.
Sumner claims that Jim even saw him that night, but Jim does not recall such an encounter, and just because he saw him doesn't mean anything for what he did the rest of the night. Trevor also here apologizes for threatening to kill Sumner one day.
I think that after hearing Sumner's point of view, I can see how it may not have been him. It is interesting now, after I've heard his point of view, that my ideas have actually changed to who I personally think did it. And I also think the same is for Trevor. No one has been arrested or convicted for the 1986 murder of 15-year-old Kerrie Ann Brown. But as more tips come in and more information is discovered concerning the case, investigators and David Ridgen inch closer to finding the people who committed the abduction, rape, and murder more than 30 years ago. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check CBC podcast Someone Knows Something series for more about Kerrie Ann Brown and more about other unsolved cases.